All right. So because week 5, we're doing a bit of an unorthodox session where we're going to recap a bunch of stuff. I'm just going to give the lecture I planned as a video. So this is about the second part of machine learning, and basically what I'll be talking about is how decision trees work, and then also a little bit about ensemble learning. Decision trees are a type of classifier that we can use when we want to discriminate between different outcomes of some sort of input data. So imagine that you have data like this, where your features are whether or not the data point lays eggs or is cold-blooded or both, and whether or not the data point is a mammal. And of course here the data points, each row in this matrix corresponds to some type of animal, right? So you could imagine that the animal which doesn't lay egg and is not cold-blooded, i.e. has 2 zeros in the feature matrix, is a dog, for example. And then the outcome is that it's a mammal. So we want to build some sort of classifier which can discriminate between whether or not an animal is a mammal based on these 2 features. So decision trees are a really good class of classifiers for this specific type of problem. So the way it works is that you ask questions to the data, and then you split it based on those questions. So the first question you might want to ask is, for example, well, we want to now discriminate on this data whether or not it's whether or not the features are whether or not the data points are cold-blooded or not. So we ask to the data points, are you cold-blooded? And all the data points that are, they go to the left, and all the data points that aren't, they go to the right. And now you have 2 new data sets, and you can sort of imagine them like this. One data set that is not cold-blooded and one data set that is. And actually one of these data sets are actually already clean. So now we know that one of these sets are strictly non-mammals. And so we proceed in a similar fashion. We now take the data set that isn't clean, and then we ask, do you lay eggs? The other question that we can ask. And then again, same procedure, we split the data points using this question as a discriminator. And then we get 2 new data sets. And now there's not more questions we can ask. And it also turns out that these new data sets have clean classes. So now we've built a little machine where we can now take a new data point and we can drop it into this machine and then ask these questions to this new data point, and then it'll end up in a bucket somewhere, in a leaf node is what we call them, at the bottom of this tree, and then it'll belong to the class which is most present in that leaf node. So you might ask, could we have asked better questions, or would there have been a different way that we could have asked these questions which somehow made more sense? And of course this is the case. Imagine that we had, for example, actually I wanted to maybe just pause this video and then try to figure it out for yourself. Okay, so assume you did that. Of course, the thing you could do is you could ask just, does it lay eggs first? And it turns out that if you do that, then you, with one question, you can perfectly split the 2 the data points into these 2 clean classes. And then you have a similar machine which does the same thing. You can drop a new data point into it and then ask this data point this particular question, and then it'll end up in one very specific leaf node where you'll know which class it belongs to, mammal or not mammal. So this is really simple when we have just small data sets with very few features, but of course sometimes that's not the case. So imagine a data set like this where you have, say, 20 different features, or how many there are, and then almost 1,000 rows, right? Then you can't sit and manually try to figure out which questions you should ask in each split in order to get the best or most simple decision tree model. Instead, we need to somehow do automatic split selection. So we'll look at that now. And one of the fundamental tools you use for doing these types of automatic split detection is something called the Shannon entropy. So the Shannon entropy, you can think of it as a little machine or a little function that takes as input a probability distribution in a discrete format, so a probability vector basically. And this probability vector is just a list which contains values between 0 and 1, and if you sum over the list, you just get 1. So that's the input, that's P. And the output is entropy. And you might have heard this word before, but if you haven't, that's fine. However, what it means in this case is sort of how spread out or how unpredictable the probability distribution is. So, in other words, if each item in the probability vector is as likely as any other item, then the entropy will be very high. And reversely, if only one item is 100% probable and all other outcomes or items are 0% probable, then the entropy will be very low, because each time you make a measurement, you'll know exactly what you get. Okay, so this entropy we use in the following fashion. Take as an example one leaf node that resulted from a split and the data points inside of it. So that could, for example, be the leaf node in the first way we ask questions, the first tree we created, where one of the leaf nodes contains 0 mammals and 8 non-mammals. And so we can create a probability distribution over mammal or species type, mammal or not. And in this case, if you draw a random point from this this subset of data points, it's 100% probable that you get a non-mammal. So the probability distribution of this is 1, 0. And so we just plug this list into our little machine, our entropy machine, or function, and then out comes a number. So this is the formula. Pause the video and look at it on your own time so you understand it. But basically that's how it works. And then you can take one of the other leaf nodes, where we ended up having 5 mammals and 2 non-mammals, and then look at the probability distribution over mammals and non-mammals in this particular leaf node. And here it's not 1, 0. Here there are 2/7 mammals and 5/7 non-mammals. Oh, sorry, reverse. 2/7 non-mammals and 5/7 non-mammals. And if you plug this vector into our entropy function, you get a different number. And of course it's higher here because the probability distribution is more spread out. So each outcome is more sort of evenly or equally likely than it was in the other leaf node here on the left. So so now the way that we compute something called the split entropy. And the split entropy is basically just the average, or the weighted average of the entropies of the class labels that end up in each leaf node. So for the first split we made, the split entropy will be 0.4, or the average split entropy will be 0.4. And the contribution from the first leaf node is 0, because it's a perfect split. We have a sort of a leaf node where there's only one type of outcome inside. And then we have another leaf node with mixed outcomes, and so that contributes with a higher entropy. And so the weighted average of these is 0.4. And now let's look at the other split we could have made in the beginning. So we could have started out asking, does it lay eggs? And in this case, we end up with leaf nodes that only have clean classes inside of them. And here, the split entropy is 0. It should make sense now that what we're after is asking questions to our data sets, which creates as clean splits as possible. In other words, that minimizes the split entropy. So the split entropy is a function for measuring the quality of a question asked to data for splitting it into subsets of data. Okay, so that was decision trees. Very briefly, there's some exercises that I want you to look at if you have time. And then hopefully some of this stuff will make more sense. But now I'm going to talk about ensemble learning. And ensemble learning is basically the idea that you can train a bunch of different models, and then you can treat each model as like a voter. And then when a new data point comes in, and this data point needs to be classified somehow. Is this a picture of a cat or a dog, whatever. Then you have each of these models classify this data point, and then the different models, they sort of vote towards, each one casts a vote. I think this is a cat. I think this is a dog. I think this is a dog. I think this is a dog. I think this is a cat. And then you take the average of those votes, and that then becomes your prediction. So this is another way to illustrate the same thing as I just said. You can imagine X being a data point, so an image, for example, and then model 1 says it's 1, model 2 says it's 1, model 3 says it's 0, and so on. And the average of all these predictions is some number, and then if it's above some threshold, for example 0.5, then we say it's a 1, and if it's below, then we say it's a 0. So the reason I'm telling you this is because decision trees are one of the types of models that we like to use as voters for ensemble learning. And the most used type of this is something called a random forest classifier. So the reason why we call it forest will make sense in just a brief moment. So the way that it works is that you train a bunch of trees, and each tree is trained on a subset of features in the input data. So you could, for example, have your model 1, which is trained on the features outlined in green here. And then you can have your model 2, which is trained on these other features. It disregards all of the other features, and then it tries to predict the outcome, whether on this data set it's like whether or not people on the Titanic survived or not. That's the rightmost column. Anyway, and then you have a third model, for example, which does the same thing but on different features. And then in the end, you take all these different models, all these different trees, and then you have each of them predict the label for a data point, and then they all vote towards what the class label should be. And the reason why we call it forest, of course, is because you're having an ensemble model which is composed of a bunch of trees. So a bunch of trees make up a forest, and that's the most simple ensemble model that you'll encounter in machine learning. But of course, coming back to like the initial example, there's a bunch of other types of ensemble models. You can actually just make your own, and it's a really good way to get a very unbiased estimate of the class pertaining to a certain data point. Yeah. All right, that's all I have for now. Thanks.